John, seeing live pictures of the president arriving in Turkey ahead of this NATO summit, many people expecting another contentious get-together between allies. What are you expecting from this summit over the next few days?
Yeah, so last year the theme was, of course, that the other NATO nations pledged to get to 5% of GDP in defense spending, and that was framed as a win for President Trump. And since that time, you've had nothing but cracks in the alliance showing up. So you've got the U.S. threatening Greenland repeatedly, and most European leaders believe that Trump still wants to go after Greenland, make it part of the United States. And then you've got Trump's deep grievance over the fact that European countries were not there to help him, in his view, during the Iran war. So, the implementation of this 5% is going to be a big theme at this summit. These are cash-strapped nations, the United Kingdom, France. They can't really afford to get to 5% of GDP because they've already way too indebted and have overextended themselves. So how you get there in this atmosphere of fiscal challenges in the European core and what the bad blood and all the fractures have been over the last year, I think are going to be the two big themes coming out of this NATO summit, while the U.S. is also openly talking about repositioning troops out of Europe, something that Congress doesn't want. So there's a lot going on. I doubt much gets done, but that's going to be the overarching theme.
John, how have the Europeans responded to this?
To the threat of Trump? I think that what they're doing, one thing they're doing is looking to diversify away from American defense contractors, which, Trump, you can give him some credit for being effective in forcing them to commit to this 5% target, which may or may not be hit. We're not going to know for 10 years. But at the same time, he's also spooked the European allies so much that they're now looking to other middle powers to form alliances of defense spending in order to help them get there, because they don't want to rely on the U.S. anymore. And I think that's going to be a big theme of the European response over the next several years.
Yeah, listening to what Mark Carney had warned in Davos. So, John, you mentioned in your note that the U.S.'s approach to NATO has really evolved. At one point, it was this threat to just withdraw from the group entirely. It has now evolved into something more nuanced. What has it moved towards?
Yeah, it's moved towards bullying and trying to get NATO to move in the U.S.'s direction. We think if you look fundamentally at the president's constraints, he can't and probably won't withdraw from NATO. That would be too explosive with his allies in Congress. Now, of course, Trump has done lots of things to rupture those relationships, so you can never say never here. However, it does seem very unlikely that the U.S. Would act to fully withdraw from NATO or truly snub its Article 5 commitments should they be called upon. So what does that mean? If the U.S. has to walk away from these threats to leave NATO, it means that they just are left trying to kind of coerce their NATO allies into getting what they want. In this case, more self-reliance for defense spending in Europe.
John, this is a president that relies on personal relationships, on his chemistry with individual leaders. He had that at one point with the leader of Italy. Who does he have that with now?
Yeah, I think that plan by the Europeans, by Mark Rutte and others, has really fallen by the wayside. I think it's kind of backfired. I think that one thing about Trump is that loyalty tends to be a one-way street, and that he asks for people to be loyal to him, and he rarely shows loyalty to them. Now, that said, he does think that the NATO allies were not loyal to the United States, and during the Iran conflict, because some of them wouldn't allow the U.S. to base out of there, and they wouldn't actively participate in the military conflict. So this idea of loyalty, I think, is a really, really, really thin piece of ice for the Europeans to stand on. And if you look at Meloni, who you mentioned, and some of the other figures across the European right, they're starting to question if Trump is an asset or a liability to them, given his constant threats against European security. So that even if you're an anti-immigration conservative like Trump is, aligning with him, which looked good maybe a year ago, is now starting to look like a much riskier bet with the European public.
Got to say, John, it didn't start in Europe, it started in Canada. I think Pierre Poilievre is a victim of a lot of this, that you can be aligned with the conservative movement, but suffer for being perceived to be aligned with the president, because the president went after Canada in a way that was totally unanticipated around the election time, John. And now you're seeing it with the Europeans. Just to take a note from that, just to build on it, John, what's the future of the conservative movement worldwide? And what's the president's role in that over the next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think going into the maybe last year after the president's election, President Trump's second election, I think you would have said there's this transnational conservative movement that had been building steam. The Hungarians had done a lot of work in the United States, for example, to create alliances between the Hungarian government and the American right. J.D. Vance went to Europe and gave a speech that really angered a lot of the Europeans, that reflected a lot of the themes of that transnational movement. And I think you're starting to see that fall apart a little bit, where the momentum on the right, where kind of the MAGA movement in the United States have been the center of it, is sort of stumbling a tiny bit. Now, that doesn't mean it's over. I think that the French elections is going to be an important one to watch, the German elections next year, what happens to the reform movement in the UK. And of course, you mentioned Canada, where there's separatist movements in Alberta that are being in part fueled by the American right. So I don't think we should count this movement out yet, but it's become a lot more complicated due to the security picture, which will be on display this week in the NATO meeting.